The moment I opened my door that night, I didn't know I was letting a curse walk into my house, one that had been waiting for me since I was 7 years old. I want to say it started with a decision, something deliberate, something I could defend later when people asked why. But the truth is messier than that. It started with rain, and exhaustion, and the kind of loneliness that makes a man stop his truck for a stranger on the side of the road without asking himself why. I worked the night shift at the wildlife station outside town, feeding orphan animals, patching fences, doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that let me avoid people for 12 hours at a stretch. That suited me fine. I liked routines. I liked knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like. Whatever peace I had built for myself, I built it out of sameness. That night, the sameness ended. The storm had rolled in fast, turning the dirt road into a river of mud, my headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. I almost missed her, a pale shape crumpled against the old fence line, barefoot, robes torn at the shoulder, shivering so hard I thought at first she was convulsing. I should have called it in. Stopped, radioed the station, waited for someone official to handle it. Instead, I put the truck in park and got out into the storm like an idiot, calling out to a stranger in the dark. She flinched away from my voice at first, a small, sharp movement, like an animal expecting a blow. Then her eyes found mine, and something in her face shifted from fear to a strange, searching recognition, as if she were checking me against a memory. "Please," she said, voice cracking. "Just for tonight. They're still looking for me." I didn't ask who they were. I didn't ask her name. I just helped her into the truck, turned the heater up as high as it would go, and drove home telling myself this was temporary, one night, a hot meal, maybe a blanket, and in the morning I'd take her to the shelter in town and wash my hands of the whole thing. That was the plan. It lasted less than an hour. Back at the house, I gave her a towel and one of my old sweaters, put the kettle on, and tried to make the whole situation feel ordinary, like this was just what neighbors did for each other. She sat at my kitchen table, dripping, watching me with an attention that felt too focused for someone who'd supposedly just escaped something terrifying. The first crack came so small I almost didn't notice it. I turned to grab 2 mugs, and when I turned back, she was already at the counter, opening the second drawer from the left, the one I never used, the one where I kept a few things from my father, an old lighter, a pocket knife, a photograph too faded to make out anymore. "You still keep this," she murmured, running her thumb over the lighter's worn brass casing, like she was greeting an old friend. I stood there, kettle in hand, feeling the first genuine chill of the night, and it had nothing to do with the storm. "How do you know that's there?" I asked, keeping my voice light, like it was a normal question, like my heart wasn't suddenly hammering against my ribs. She blinked, and for a moment her expression flickered, confusion, maybe, or something closer to panic at her own mistake. "Lucky guess," she said, setting the lighter down carefully, like it might break. "Old houses. Everyone keeps drawers like that. It wasn't a lucky guess." That drawer had been closed, untouched, for years. I barely opened it myself. There was no way a stranger, soaked and frightened, wandering in off the road, could have known it existed, let alone known exactly which drawer, exactly which item mattered enough for her to reach for it first. I told myself to let it go. People say strange things when they're in shock. Maybe she'd mistaken my kitchen for someone else's, some fragmented déjà vu from wherever she'd run from. I poured the tea, sat down across from her, and tried to steer the conversation somewhere normal. "So, what's your name?" She hesitated, just slightly too long. "Mira," she said, though something about the way she said it made it sound borrowed, like a coat she'd pulled on quickly before answering the door. "And you're running from?" "Who, exactly?" Her hands tightened around the mug. "A place I used to belong to. I don't expect you to understand. I just needed somewhere they wouldn't think to look." It was vague enough to be reasonable, specific enough to sound rehearsed. I let it sit between us, unspoken, and told myself I would sort it out properly in the morning, call the station, maybe the sheriff, hand this off to someone whose job it actually was to handle runaway cult refugees, or whatever she was. I almost did exactly that. I reached for my phone on the counter, already composing the call in my head: a stray traveler, storm-stranded, needs shelter and possibly protective custody, nothing more complicated than that. My thumb hovered over the screen. That's when she said it. Kale. I stopped cold. Nobody called me that. Not in 15 years. Not since I was a child, since a version of myself I barely remembered, before the accident, before the fever that nearly killed me, before my family stopped using that name altogether like it belonged to someone who no longer existed. I had buried that name so deep I sometimes forgot I'd ever answered to it. "What did you just call me?" My voice came out flatter than I intended, stripped of the polite curiosity I'd been performing all night. She looked up at me, and for the briefest second, something ancient moved behind her eyes, not fear, not confusion, but a terrible, patient familiarity, like she was looking at something she had waited a very long time to see again. Then it was gone, replaced instantly by wide-eyed innocence. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said that. It just came out. I wanted to believe her. I wanted, badly, to believe that this was coincidence, exhaustion, some trick of stress-addled memory on both our parts. But my hand was still frozen over my phone, and my pulse was roaring in my ears, and somewhere underneath all my careful adult rationalizations, some old, childish instinct was screaming at me to open the door and tell her to leave, right now, before whatever this was could finish waking up. I didn't listen to it. Instead, I set the phone down, told her she could sleep on the couch, and went to bed telling myself that tomorrow, in the daylight, all of this would make sense. I didn't sleep. And somewhere past midnight, I heard her moving through my house in the dark, footsteps that knew exactly where the creaking floorboards were, exactly which doors not to touch, exactly where, in a house she'd supposedly never seen before tonight, everything belonged. I told myself the footsteps were nothing. Old houses creak. Storms make strange sounds through thin walls. But no amount of reasoning could explain how someone who claimed to have never set foot in my home moved through it without a single misstep, without a single hesitation, as if she had memorized it long before I ever built it. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to her cross the living room floor. She skipped the third floorboard from the hallway, the one that always groaned under weight. I skipped it too, out of habit, every single day. No stranger should have known to avoid it in the dark, in an unfamiliar house, without so much as a flashlight. I told myself I was imagining patterns where there were none. Coincidence dressed up as dread. But then I heard her stop right outside my late father's old study door, a room I hadn't opened in years, a room with no external markings, no plaque, nothing to indicate its purpose from the hallway. She murmured something. Not English. Not any language I recognized, low and rhythmic, almost like a chant recited from memory rather than composed in the moment. I lay frozen, straining to catch fragments, but the words slid past comprehension, foreign and unervingly intimate, like a lullaby meant specifically for me. Then, just as suddenly, silence. I don't know how long I lay there afterward, telling myself to get up, to check on her, to demand answers. Fear kept me still longer than I'd like to admit. Eventually, curiosity won out over caution, and I crept out of bed, easing my door open without a sound. She was standing in front of my father's study, one hand pressed flat against the wood, head bobbed like she was listening to something on the other side. In the weak moonlight through the window, I caught sight of something at the base of her neck, dark lines curling just beneath her collar, almost like veins, almost like ink, pulsing faintly before fading back into ordinary skin. I must have made a sound, because she turned instantly, and for half a second, her eyes weren't the frightened, exhausted eyes of the girl I'd found on the roadside. They were sharper. Older. Amused, even, in a way that made my skin crawl. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, voice perfectly soft again, perfectly ordinary, as though I'd imagined everything. "What were you doing?" My voice cracked despite my best effort to sound calm. "I got lost looking for the bathroom," she said, offering an embarrassed little laugh. "This house is bigger than it looks." It wasn't. My house was small, practical, nothing labyrinthine about it. The bathroom was directly across from the guest room, impossible to miss even half asleep. I said nothing, just watched her retreat back toward the couch, movements fluid and unbothered, while every nerve in my body screamed that something profoundly wrong had just brushed past me in the dark. I didn't sleep again that night. Around 4 a.m, unable to bear the silence, I crept toward the living room to check on her, tell myself it was concern, though it was really surveillance. She lay curled on the couch, breathing evenly, utterly still, the picture of harmless exhaustion. Until she spoke. Her lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was lower, resonant, carrying a strange, layered quality like two voices speaking at once, slightly out of sync. "You still hide from yourself, little one," the voice murmured, eyes closed, clearly asleep, clearly unaware.
Even now. Even after everything I gave you.
I stood rooted in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. The room felt colder suddenly, air pressing down like something unseen had entered alongside her sleeping form. You don't remember, the voice continued, almost mournfully, but your body does.
It always did.
I don't know how long I stood there before she stirred, murmured something incoherent in her normal voice, and rolled over, seemingly waking briefly before drifting back into ordinary sleep. Whatever had spoken through her retreated as quickly as it surfaced, leaving no trace except my racing heart and the certainty, cold and absolute, that I hadn't imagined any of it. By morning, she was different again, soft-spoken, apologetic for intruding, thanking me repeatedly for my kindness with wide, grateful eyes that held no trace of the voice I'd heard in the dark. She helped prepare breakfast without being asked, moving through my kitchen with the same unsettling familiarity as the night before, reaching for spices before I told her where they were kept, humming a tune I hadn't heard since childhood, one my mother used to sing, one I hadn't thought about in over a decade.
Where did you learn that song?
I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She paused, spoon midair, expression flickering with genuine confusion.
I don't know. It just felt right to hum.
I wanted to press further, demand real answers, force her to explain the impossible knowledge she kept betraying in small, careless moments. But some instinct held me back, not trust, exactly, but something closer to dread, the sense that pulling too hard on this thread might unravel something I wasn't ready to face.
Instead, I told her she could stay one more day. Just until the storm cleared.
Just until I figured out what, exactly, I had let into my house. She smiled at that, small and grateful, and for a moment looked entirely, achingly human. But later that afternoon, cleaning up after lunch, I found something tucked beneath the couch cushion where she'd slept, a small, tarnished charm shaped like a coiled serpent devouring its own tail, warm to the touch despite the cold room, humming faintly with something I couldn't name.
I recognized it immediately.
It was identical to the one I'd worn as a child, the one my mother burned the day I nearly died of fever at age 7, the one she swore, through tears I never fully understood, would never come near me again. I told myself the charm meant nothing. Old superstitions, childhood fevers, grieving mothers who burned trinkets to feel like they had control over something uncontrollable. I put it in a drawer, told myself I'd deal with it later, and tried to build one ordinary day out of the wreckage of the night before. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the yard soaked and glittering under pale sunlight. I decided the plan still held. I would drive her into town, hand her off to the county services office, let people trained for exactly this kind of situation figure out who she was and where she belonged.
It was the sensible choice. The safe choice. I clung to it like a rope.
She seemed almost eager to go along with it, dressed in borrowed clothes that fit her a little too well, hair combed neatly, playing the part of a grateful, harmless stranger so convincingly that I almost let myself believe the previous night had been some exhausted hallucination.
Almost.
On the drive, she pointed out the diner on Route 9 before we passed the sign. They used to make good pie there, she said absently, staring out the window.
Cherry, I think. You always ordered cherry. My hands tightened on the wheel. I've never been to that diner.
She blinked, confusion flickering across her face like static.
Haven't you? A pause. Maybe I'm thinking of somewhere else.
I said nothing, but my knuckles stayed white the rest of the drive.
At the office, my coworker Danny met us in the parking lot. We'd agreed to grab lunch after I dropped her off, an ordinary plan for an ordinary day that no longer felt ordinary at all.
He took one look at her and grinned, nudging me with his elbow.
Well. Didn't know you had company these days. It's not like that, I said quickly.
She needed a place to stay last night.
I'm dropping her off here.
Danny raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but let it go, chatting easily with her while we waited for someone from the office to come out. She answered his questions politely, vaguely, no last name, no clear origin, no explanation that held together under scrutiny. Danny didn't seem to notice the way her answers slid past logic like water through fingers.
I noticed everything now.
Then Danny said something that made my stomach drop. You know, you look a little familiar, he said, tilting his head at her.
You ever live around here? Feels like I've seen you somewhere before.
She smiled, sweet and easy.
I don't think so. I'd remember a face like yours.
Danny laughed it off, flattered, oblivious. But I caught something in her expression as she said it, the faintest, private amusement, like she was enjoying a joke none of us were in on. The woman at the intake desk took her information, promised someone would follow up, and that should have been the end of it. I should have driven away, gone to lunch with Danny, let the system take over from there. Instead, I found myself lingering in the parking lot, watching through the window as she sat in the waiting area, hands folded, posture perfect, utterly unlike a frightened runaway.
"You okay, man?" Danny asked, following my gaze. "You're acting weird."
She knew things, I said quietly, before I could stop myself.
Things she shouldn't know. About my house. About me. Danny snorted.
Maybe she's just perceptive. Or maybe you're just rattled from finding a half-drowned stranger on your porch.
I'd be freaked out too. I wanted to believe that.
I wanted, desperately, for there to be a simple explanation, cold logic, coincidence, my own exhaustion inventing patterns in random noise. But even as I told myself that, I remembered the charm in my drawer, warm to the touch, and the voice that hadn't been hers speaking in the dark.
We didn't make it to lunch.
20 minutes later, the intake office called. She'd disappeared from the waiting room. No one saw her leave, no cameras caught which direction she'd gone. Just gone, like she'd never been there at all. I drove home faster than I should have, telling myself I was relieved, telling myself this was exactly the outcome I wanted, problem solved, mystery gone, my ordinary life restored. She was sitting on my porch steps when I pulled into the driveway, exactly where I'd first found her, knees drawn up, waiting with the patient calm of someone who had never doubted I would come back to this exact spot. "You left the office," I said, stepping out of the truck, voice sharper than I intended. "I don't belong there," she said simply.
"I belong here. With you."
A pause, her eyes searching mine with unsettling tenderness.
"You still don't remember, do you? But you will."
Behind her, faint and easy to miss unless you were looking, the porch light flickered once, and for just a moment, her shadow on the wall stretched too long, curled at the edges like something with wings folding closed. By the time I found her waiting on my porch, I already knew, on some buried level, that this wasn't a story with a simple ending. But knowing something and accepting it are different things, and I spent the rest of that day pretending I could still choose the safe path, send her away properly this time, call someone official, wash my hands of whatever strangeness had attached itself to my life.
That night, someone else made the choice for me.
I heard the car first, gravel crunching slow and deliberate up my driveway, headlights sweeping across the living room curtains.
No one visited me out here.
My nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the road, and Danny always called before dropping by.
This was different. Measured. Unhurried. The kind of arrival that wasn't asking permission.
She went rigid the moment she heard it, her whole posture shifting from soft and unguarded to something coiled and alert. "Don't answer it," she whispered, gripping my arm with more strength than her thin frame should have allowed.
"Who is it? Please. Just don't."
But I was already moving toward the window, some old, foolish instinct telling me I could handle whatever this was through sheer stubbornness. Outside stood a man in plain dark robes, unremarkable except for the calm, unblinking way he studied my house, as though he already knew every room inside it. I opened the door before she could stop me. "Good evening," he said, voice pleasant, almost warm. "I believe you've been taking care of something that belongs to us." "She's not property," I said, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. His smile didn't waver.
"No. Of course not. But you misunderstand me."
His eyes flicked past me, toward the shadow hovering just behind my shoulder.
"I wasn't referring to her."
The words landed like a slow-dropping stone.
"What does that mean?"
"It means," he said, stepping just close enough that I caught the faint smell of incense clinging to his robes, "that you were promised to us long before she was ever sent to find you."
A childhood fever. A desperate mother.
A bargain struck in a moment of grief, sealed the day you should have died and didn't. His gaze softened, almost pitying.
"You don't remember making that agreement. But agreements like that don't require memory. Only blood."
Behind me, she made a small, wounded sound, and for the first time since I'd found her, I heard something like genuine fear in her voice.
"He's lying. Don't listen to him."
"Am I?" the man asked mildly, without looking at her.
"Ask him about the mark, then."
"The one that appeared on his chest the night she arrived."
I imagine he's noticed it by now.
I hadn't told anyone about the mark, hadn't even fully admitted it to myself, dismissing the faint, dark shape beneath my collarbone as a bruise, an allergic reaction, anything but what it actually resembled, the same coiled serpent from the charm hidden in my drawer.
My silence answered for me. The man nodded slowly, satisfied. We don't wish you harm. Quite the opposite. We've protected that mark for years, waited patiently for the binding to mature naturally.
But she was never meant to reach you like this, unsanctioned, unsupervised, outside the proper rites. His expression darkened slightly. She's accelerating something that should have taken years to unfold gently.
Left unchecked, it may not end well for either of you.
You're saying she's dangerous, I said carefully. I'm saying she's hungry, he corrected. And hunger, unmanaged, consumes indiscriminately. Behind me, she stepped forward despite clearly wanting to flee, chin lifted with a defiance that startled me.
I've protected him longer than your precious sect ever did. I've kept her contained. Kept us both human enough to survive.
The man studied her for a long moment, something almost like respect flickering across his composed features.
Then you understand better than anyone what happens if that containment fails. He didn't ask to come inside. He didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything I could point to afterward as clearly hostile.
He simply left a small folded paper on my doorstep, bowed slightly, and turned back toward his car, disappearing into the dark as unhurriedly as he'd arrived. I picked up the paper with trembling hands. Inside, in careful handwriting, was a single sentence: the mark will fully awaken within the month. Choose who guides you through it before it chooses for you. I turned to her, 100 questions crowding my throat at once, but she was staring at the mark visible now through my half-open shirt, her expression caught somewhere between grief and longing. You were 7, she said quietly, more to herself than to me.
So small. I promised I'd only borrow a little of your warmth to keep you alive that night. I never meant for it to become this. Become what? I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. Her eyes lifted to mine, dark and ancient and achingly sad. A debt that's been collecting interest for 15 years, and I'm afraid, Kale, that tonight, it's finally come due. The paper stayed on my kitchen table all night, its single sentence burning in my mind long after she'd gone quiet, curled into the corner of my couch like something bracing for a storm. The mark will fully awaken within the month. I didn't sleep. I didn't try. Instead, I sat across from her, waiting for an explanation I both needed and dreaded. Tell me everything, I finally said, as dawn crept gray through the windows. From the beginning. No more half-truths. She was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing the rim of her cold tea. Do you remember the fever? When you were 7? I did vaguely, in the way childhood memories blur into impressions rather than facts. A burning heat that wouldn't break. My mother crying in the hallway, thinking I couldn't hear her. A doctor's hushed voice saying words like unlikely and prepare yourselves. I remember almost dying, I said. I don't remember much else. Your mother didn't know what else to do, she said softly. The hospital had given up. So she went somewhere else for help, somewhere desperate parents go when medicine fails and prayer isn't enough anymore. She found the sect. Not the twisted version you saw at your door tonight. Back then, it was smaller, quieter. People who genuinely believed they could bridge the space between dying and living if the price was right. And the price was me. The price, she said carefully, was an offering. A vessel, strong enough to carry something old and starving, something that had been trapped between worlds for centuries, waiting for exactly the kind of desperate bargain your mother was willing to make. She looked up, eyes glassy. I was that hunger. I'd been bound and rebound through failed vessels for generations, burning through each one too fast, leaving nothing behind but corpses and grieving families. Your mother didn't know that part. She just wanted her son to live. My chest tightened. So they used me. As a child. Without my consent. You gave a kind of consent, she said gently, though the words offered no comfort. Not with words, you were far too young, and half-conscious with fever. But in the old rites, willingness isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's just the will to survive, strong enough to answer a call you don't understand. You reached for warmth in the dark. I answered. That was enough to bind us, even if neither of us understood what we were agreeing to. And then what happened? I demanded. If we were bound, why don't I remember any of this? Why did I grow up normal, average, completely unaware that something like you existed? Because I chose to wait, she said. The sect wanted to complete the binding immediately, force the merge while you were young and pliable, mold you into whatever shape best suited their purposes. I refused. You were a child. It felt wrong to consume a life that had barely begun living. So I sealed myself away instead, buried deep enough that you'd grow up thinking the fever was just an ordinary sickness you survived through luck. 15 years, I said slowly, piecing it together. You waited 15 years. I watched, she corrected. From a distance, through fragments, through dreams you probably dismissed as nightmares the next morning. I watched you grow into someone kind, someone who still stopped his truck for a stranger in a storm despite every reasonable instinct telling him not to. I told myself that meant something, that maybe when the binding finally activated, it wouldn't have to be the violent, consuming thing it had always been before. But the sect found out, I guessed. She nodded. They've been searching for the vessel that slipped away from their control for years. When I finally couldn't contain the awakening any longer, when your mark started responding to my presence, drawing me toward you against my own careful restraint, they tracked the disturbance. That's who was chasing me the night you found me on the road. Not because I ran from them originally. Because I ran to you, and they've been trying to intercept me ever since. The weight of it settled over me slowly, reshaping everything I thought I understood about my own life, the fever, the years of vague unease I'd never examined too closely, the strange sense sometimes, late at night, that something was waiting patiently for me just outside the edges of memory. What happens now? I asked. If the mark fully awakens? Her expression darkened, the softness draining from her voice. Then whatever's been sleeping inside both of us wakes up completely, and I won't be able to promise you which version of me survives that. The one who's grown to care about you these past few days. Or the one who's spent centuries starving, and finally, after everything, gets to eat. Her warning hung in the air long after she'd stopped speaking, and over the following days, I began to see exactly what she meant. The girl who'd stumbled into my life during a storm was becoming harder to find beneath the surface, not gone, exactly, but increasingly interrupted, like a radio signal losing strength against a stronger frequency. It started small. She'd be mid-sentence, laughing at something Danny said over the phone, and her voice would drop half an octave, the laughter turning into something colder before catching itself and correcting back to normal. She'd apologize immediately afterward, blaming exhaustion, blaming stress, blaming anything except the truth we both now understood too well. I started keeping a mental log, almost against my will, cataloging the moments when she was unmistakably herself, and the moments when something older and hungrier answered in her place. Daytime, she was gentle, uncertain, prone to small kindnesses like leaving flowers on the kitchen table or humming half-remembered lullabies while she cooked. Nighttime brought the other one, sharp-eyed, possessive, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. The first real test came on a Thursday, when Danny called to invite us both to a coworker's barbecue. She agreed immediately, cheerful, eager even, clearly craving something ordinary after days trapped in my house avoiding the sex attention. I should have said no. Instead, I let myself hope, foolishly, that a few normal hours among normal people might slow whatever was accelerating inside her. The barbecue started fine. She charmed everyone effortlessly, asking thoughtful questions, remembering names after being introduced only once, laughing at jokes with genuine warmth. For an hour, I almost let myself believe we could have something resembling a future, ordinary weekends, ordinary friends, ordinary problems. Then Danny's coworker, Priya, leaned in a little too close while refilling her drink, laughing at something I'd said, her hand brushing my arm in a way that was probably innocent and definitely too casual for someone I'd only just met. I felt the shift before I saw it. Across the yard, she went very still, drink halfway to her lips, eyes fixed on Priya's hand with an expression that had nothing soft left in it. When she spoke, moving toward us with unhurried, deliberate steps, her voice carried that unmistakable double resonance I'd only heard once before, in the middle of the night, when I thought she was asleep. You should be more careful, she said to Priya, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes, about touching things that already belonged to someone. The yard went quiet. Priya laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke, backing away with murmured apologies. I grabbed her arm, gently, urgently, and steered her toward the car before anyone could notice how wrong the moment had felt. What was that? I demanded once we were alone, engine idling in the driveway.
She blinked rapidly, disoriented, color returning slowly to her face like someone waking from a fainting spell.
I don't remember saying anything.
What did I say? I told her, watching her expression crumple with genuine horror as the words registered.
I didn't mean to.
I swear, I wasn't in control of that. I know, I said quietly, though the knowing didn't make it less frightening. 2 days later, I found out through the grapevine that Priya had been abruptly transferred to another department, her supervisor citing vague performance concerns that hadn't existed the week before. When I asked her about it, she went very quiet, guilt washing over her features. I didn't do that, she whispered.
Not on purpose. I don't even remember doing it at all.
But some part of you did, I said, not unkindly, just honestly. Some part of you decided she was a threat and removed her. That's not me, she insisted, tears gathering.
That's her. The part I've spent centuries trying to keep asleep.
That night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table and finally asked the question I'd been avoiding since the sex messenger left his warning on my doorstep.
How do I tell you apart? When it's happening. How do I know which one of you I'm talking to?
She considered this for a long moment, something fragile and pleading in her expression. My eyes change first, she said finally.
Just slightly.
Darker at the edges, like ink spreading through water. If you ever see that, please, Kale.
Don't wait to find out which one of us wins.
I didn't know yet what winning would even look like, or what I was supposed to do if I saw it happen. But I memorized her instructions anyway, filing them away like a soldier preparing for a battle he still didn't fully understand, not realizing how soon I'd need them. The sec returned exactly as they'd promised, not with warnings this time, but with intent. It happened on the 11th night after the barbecue, when the moon hung low and swollen behind storm clouds, and the mark on my chest had begun to burn steadily, no longer just an occasional flicker of heat. I heard the cars first, plural this time, at least 3, engines cutting off in unison at the end of my driveway. She went rigid beside me at the kitchen counter, the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables slipping from her fingers and clattering against the floor. They're not here to negotiate this time, she said, voice tight. They're here to finish what they started. I barely had time to process her words before the first knock came, not polite this time, but firm, deliberate, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps circling the house. Through the window, I counted 5 figures in dark robes, the messenger from before at their center, his calm expression replaced now with something more urgent. Kale, he called through the door, no longer bothering with pleasantries.
We're not leaving without completing the rite. You can make this easy, or you can make it painful. Either way, the binding gets severed tonight. Severed how?
I shouted back, though some cold, instinctive part of me already suspected the answer wasn't going to involve me walking away unharmed. The vessel dies, she whispered beside me, answering before he could. That's how these old rites usually work when there's no cooperation.
They can't extract centuries-old hunger from a living body without unmaking it first. It's cleaner that way. For them, at least. Panic rose in my throat, cold and immediate. They're going to kill me?
They're going to try, she said, and for the first time since I'd found her on that storm-soaked road, I heard something genuinely lethal in her voice, not the possessive edge from the barbecue, but something colder, older, entirely unbothered by mortality.
I won't let that happen.
The door splintered inward before I could respond, the sex enforcers moving with practiced efficiency, chanting low and rhythmic as they spread through my living room, forming some kind of pattern on the floor with dark powder that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, an old fireplace poker, useless against whatever these people actually were, but instinct doesn't care about usefulness in moments like that. She stepped in front of me before I could swing it, her posture shifting, spine straightening, the softness draining from her features in real time. Her eyes went dark at the edges exactly as she'd described, ink spreading slow and deliberate through the whites, until there was nothing human left in her gaze at all. You should have left the boy alone, she said, and the voice that emerged was layered, resonant, carrying weight that made the windows rattle faintly in their frames. I spared him once. I won't spare any of you. What followed wasn't a fight so much as an unmaking. The nearest enforcer lunged forward mid-chant, blade raised, and she moved faster than my eyes could properly track, closing the distance and pressing her palm flat against his chest.
He didn't scream. He simply folded, collapsing inward like something deflating, the chant dying in his throat before he hit the floor.
The messenger barked something urgent in a language I didn't recognize, and the remaining enforcers scattered into a defensive formation, forming a circle of symbols around themselves with frantic, desperate speed. She turned toward them slowly, and I caught, for just a moment, an expression on her face that terrified me more than anything the sect had done. Pure, unrestrained hunger, centuries of starvation finally given permission to feed. "Wait," I shouted, before I could stop myself, before I could think through what I was doing.
"Don't! Please, not like this."
She paused, head tilting toward me with unnerving slowness, the darkness in her eyes flickering uncertainly, as though my voice had reached something buried deep beneath the hunger. "They tried to kill you," she said, voice still layered, still inhuman.
"Why would you protect them?"
"I'm not protecting them," I said, forcing myself to hold her gaze despite every instinct screaming to look away.
"I'm protecting you.
Whatever you become after this, I don't want it to be someone who did this because there was no other choice left." The messenger seized the pause, shouting a final command, and the remaining enforcers surged forward together, weapons and chants combining into one last desperate assault. She turned back to face them, and just before chaos swallowed the room entirely, she looked at me over her shoulder with something achingly human breaking through the darkness in her eyes. "Then trust me," she said. "Just this once, let me finish what they started without you having to watch."
I don't remember closing my eyes.
I remember the roar of chanting collapsing into silence, the smell of burnt powder and something older, sharper, underneath it, like ozone after lightning, mixed with something almost floral, almost sweet. When I opened my eyes again, the living room looked like a battlefield abandoned mid-fight, robes scattered, symbols scorched black into the floorboards, and 5 bodies that weren't dead, exactly, but weren't quite whole either, breathing shallowly, eyes vacant, as though whatever animated them had simply been switched off. She stood in the center of it all, back to me, shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths.
The darkness hadn't fully receded from her eyes yet.
When she finally turned to face me, I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before, not triumph, not hunger, but a kind of exhausted grief, like someone waking up from a violence they didn't fully choose.
"Is it over?" I asked, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be.
"For tonight," she said. Her voice had lost the double resonance, but it still carried something unfamiliar, heavier than before.
"The messenger got away. He'll come back with more of them, better prepared. This bought us time. Nothing more."
I looked at the bodies on my floor, at the scorched symbols, at the woman standing in the wreckage who had, just minutes ago, unmade a man with a single touch.
"What happened to you back there? At the end?"
She was quiet for a long moment, arms wrapped around herself as though cold despite the warmth of the room.
"I fed," she admitted finally.
"Not fully, you stopped me before that.
But enough.
Enough to remember what it feels like, after centuries of starving myself to stay small enough not to hurt you."
"Is that why your eyes are still like that?" I asked, nodding toward the ink-dark edges that hadn't fully retreated.
She caught her reflection in the darkened window and flinched slightly at what she saw there. "It takes longer to recede now. Every time I let her surface, she stays a little longer before retreating. I don't know how many more times I can pull her back before she simply
doesn't go." The implication sat heavy between us.
I moved closer, despite every instinct telling me to keep my distance from something that had just demonstrated exactly how lethal it could be.
"What happens if she doesn't go back? If she stays in control permanently?"
"Then the girl you found on that road stops existing," she said simply, without self-pity, just quiet, terrible honesty. "And you're left with something that remembers loving you, but doesn't remember why that should matter more than simply consuming what's in front of her." I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the poker still clutched uselessly in my hand, staring at the woman, or the thing wearing her shape, standing amid the wreckage of my living room.
There has to be another option.
Some way to separate you two properly, safely, without the sect and without either of you disappearing. "Maybe," she said, though her tone carried little hope. "The old rites the sect uses are designed to sever the binding by destroying the vessel. But there are older stories, fragments, mostly forgotten, about willing unions instead of forced separations. About hosts and hungers choosing to share a single fate instead of one consuming the other. What would that require?"
She met my eyes, and for a moment, the darkness at their edges retreated just slightly, revealing something achingly vulnerable underneath.
It would require you to accept both of us completely, not just the parts of me you find comforting, but the hunger too, the violence you just watched me commit without hesitation. It would mean choosing this, fully, with open eyes, instead of stumbling into it through 15 years of ignorance. I thought about the messenger's warning, about the mark burning steadily hotter against my skin, about the bodies on my floor that had nearly been mine instead. I thought about the softness she'd shown me over breakfast, humming half-remembered lullabies, and the terrifying efficiency with which she'd just protected me from 5 armed enforcers without so much as raising her voice. And if I don't choose that, I said slowly. If I try to run from this instead? Then eventually, she said, the sect finds us again, better prepared, and next time, I might not win. Or worse, I might win so completely that there's nothing human left in me afterward to regret it. Outside, the first hint of dawn was creeping over the horizon, painting the wreckage of my living room in soft, deceptively peaceful light. Somewhere beyond the tree line, I knew the messenger was already regrouping, already preparing whatever came next. I looked at her, at both of her, the frightened girl and the ancient hunger sharing one exhausted body, and understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that there was no version of my old, ordinary life waiting for me on the other side of this. Whatever happened next, I was choosing it with my eyes fully open. Then teach me, I said quietly. Whatever the old rite requires. I'd rather choose this with you than lose you to something neither of us wanted. We had 3 days before the messenger returned, 3 days to prepare for a ritual neither of us fully understood, built from fragments of half-forgotten stories and her own uncertain memory of rites older than the sect itself. She spent most of that time in restless research, sketching symbols on scrap paper, crossing them out, muttering half-remembered incantations under her breath like someone trying to recall a language she'd only heard spoken once, centuries ago. This isn't like their rite, she warned me, the night before, as we cleared space in the living room where the sect's enforcers had fallen days earlier. Theirs is designed to sever. This one is designed to bind properly, willingly, on equal terms instead of one side simply consuming the other. If it fails, we don't get a second attempt. Either it takes, or it destroys us both trying. And if it works? Then we share this, she said, gesturing vaguely at herself, at the darkness still lingering faintly at the edges of her eyes even now. Not host and hunger anymore. Something closer to partnership. I stopped needing to fight her for control, because you're no longer just a vessel to protect, you become an anchor strong enough to hold both of us steady. We drew the symbols with care that night, using chalk instead of the sect's dark powder, arranging them not as a cage but as a circle meant to be entered together, side by side. She explained each mark as we worked, this one for memory, this one for consent, this one for the fever that started everything 15 years ago, a symbol meant to acknowledge the debt honestly instead of erasing it by force. By the time we finished, dawn was creeping through the windows again, the same soft light that had witnessed the aftermath of violence now witnessing something far more fragile, 2 people, or perhaps 2 beings, choosing deliberately what fate had only stumbled into accidentally when I was 7 years old. Are you ready? She asked, standing at the edge of the circle, her voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. No, I admitted honestly. But I'm choosing this anyway. She smiled at that, small and genuine, before stepping into the circle beside me. The moment we were both inside the boundary, the chalk lines ignited softly, not with fire exactly, but with a warm, golden light that pulsed in rhythm with the mark on my chest. The ritual itself defied easy description afterward, not pain exactly, though it burned, and not peace exactly, though something in it felt like relief long overdue. I felt her presence fully for the first time, not as a stranger's voice interrupting a familiar face, but as an entire history unfolding inside my own mind, centuries of hunger, generations of failed vessels, and beneath all of it, a genuine, aching loneliness that had waited 15 years for someone willing to choose her back. At the center of it, I felt the moment the sex messenger arrived outside, sensed rather than heard, drawn by the surge of energy radiating from my house. I felt her, both of her, the girl and the hunger, finally united rather than warring, turn her attention outward, calm and certain in a way she hadn't been able to manage before. The messenger didn't get the chance to interrupt the rite this time. Whatever barrier the willing binding created held firm against his attempts to breach it, his chanting faltering uselessly against a boundary built on consent rather than coercion. Through the window, I saw him finally step back, expression shifting from calculated calm to something like genuine alarm, before he retreated entirely, engine roaring away into the distance. When the golden light finally faded, I found myself kneeling in the center of the circle, exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced before, but intact, whole, in a way I hadn't quite been before that night. Beside me, she opened her eyes slowly, and for the first time since the storm that brought her into my life, the darkness at their edges was gone completely, replaced by something steady, calm, unmistakably present.
Did it work?
I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer, could feel it settling into place alongside my own heartbeat.
We're not host in hunger anymore, she said softly, reaching for my hand. We're something neither the sect nor centuries of old stories ever accounted for. Something chosen instead of stolen.
Outside, the sun rose fully over the horizon, and for the first time in 15 years, the mark on my chest didn't burn at all, it simply rested there, quiet and warm, like something finally home. 3 weeks passed before the sect sent word again, not soldiers this time, not enforcers with chants and dark powder, but a single letter, delivered quietly to my mailbox like any ordinary piece of correspondence. Inside, in the same careful handwriting as before, the messenger had written only a few lines: "The binding you completed cannot be undone by force.
We acknowledge this.
The debt, as far as our order is concerned, is settled.
We will not return."
I read it twice at the kitchen table, then handed it to her without a word. She read it slowly, her expression unreadable, before setting it down and exhaling something that sounded, for the first time since I'd known her, like genuine relief.
"They're not lying," she said. "A willing binding, completed properly, isn't something they can override.
There's no vessel to extract, no hunger to sever, just two people who chose each other. Even their oldest rites don't have a mechanism to unmake that. Life afterward didn't return to what it had been before, how could it, after everything, but it settled, slowly, into something that resembled peace."
She stayed.
Not as a fugitive hiding from pursuers, not as a hunger barely restrained beneath a fragile human shell, but as herself, whole and steady in a way she told me she'd never experienced across centuries of fractured, temporary vessels.
The dark-edged eyes never fully returned after that night.
Sometimes, in moments of strong emotion, anger, fear, once, memorably, when Danny made an ill-advised joke at a barbecue about her mysterious past, I'd catch the faintest flicker at the corners of her irises, a shadow of what used to consume her completely. But it always receded on its own now, gentle and controlled, no longer a war she had to fight alone. Danny, for his part, never learned the full truth. He assumed, reasonably enough, that she'd simply resolved whatever complicated situation she'd been running from, and left it at that, too pleased to see me happier than he'd seen me in years to ask further questions. Some mysteries, I learned, people are content to let remain mysteries, as long as the outcome looks enough like happiness. The charm I'd found beneath the couch cushion that first week now sat openly on my kitchen windowsill, no longer hidden in a drawer, no longer a secret either of us needed to keep from the other. She told me once that it had been the very first anchor she'd used to find me across the years of fragmented searching, a small piece of the original binding, humming faintly with recognition every time I came near it, even before either of us understood why. One evening, months later, sitting together on the porch where I'd first found her collapsed against the fence, she asked me the question I'd been waiting for, in some form, since the night the ritual bound us properly together.
"Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing this. Choosing me.
Even knowing everything it cost you, the sect, the danger, the life you might have had instead." I thought about the ordinary life I'd built before that storm of routines, solitude, a carefully maintained distance from anything unpredictable. I thought about the 7-year-old boy who'd made a bargain he didn't understand, simply because some desperate, childish instinct had reached for warmth in the dark and found her waiting on the other side.
"No," I said, and meant it completely. "My body was never really only mine to begin with. Not since I was 7.
The only thing that changed is that now, I'm the one who decided who I share it with." She smiled at that, small, warm, entirely human, and rested her head against my shoulder as the last light of evening faded over the treeline, the mark on my chest resting quiet and unburning, exactly where it belonged.
We never saw the sect again.
Whatever hunger had once waited 15 years to consume me had, in the end, simply decided to stay, not as something taken, but as someone chosen, freely, on both sides of an old and complicated debt finally, peacefully repaid.